The pep rally was loud, obnoxious, and unnecessary. Other than getting out of class and a chance to stare at the current girl of his dreams, Tom would rather have been in a dentist's chair. He had nothing against football, but he had no love for it either. He sat on the bleachers and stole glances at a dark-haired girl on the other side of the gym. She had brown hair, a small waist, terrific breasts, and a pair of legs that drove his mind to fantasy in a matter of seconds. He figured she knew about her legs and their devastating effects. She showed them off frequently and well. He blamed them for the C he got in biology. If he'd spent half as much time studying that crap as he did the curves of her legs and hips, he might have scored better on the tests. He certainly wasn't scoring with her, so why not study the course material? Now that their junior year had begun, he was pretty sure she would never be his girlfriend. It didn't help when the big bohunk of a boyfriend of hers, a basketball player, squeezed her around the waist while they jumped up and down and cheered the football players running around on the floor. At least he got to see her jump. Things could be worse. He tried not to roll his eyes when the teacher dressed as the school mascot rolled around the gym on a Harley. The rest of the day passed quickly. Tom went home, packed a small bag, ate supper with his family, and walked into the woods for his weekend campout with Andy and John. Much like their BB gun fights, they just met somewhere in the woods. Unlike the days before they got kicked out of their Boy Scout troop, which had, strangely enough, rules against playing catch with axes, their campouts had no agenda, no duty roster. They went, they did what they wanted, and they went home when it was time. He found a good spot near the power lines that cut through the property about 50 yards from the 2-track that ran along the towers. The ground was relatively flat, and there was more than enough deadwood nearby to support a fire. He heard his friends coming, saw the beams of their flashlights through the trees, and smiled. They would have seen his fire sooner if they let their eyes get used to the dark instead of blinding themselves with flashlights. He'd learned a few things in the Boy Scouts in addition to the merits of not throwing hatchets. By the time they crashed through the brush and found the campsite, he was finished with his stew. He laughed when he saw them. John carried a frame backpack, and it looked full. His air rifle was lashed to the frame with the barrel pointed up like a good boy. Andy was huffing and puffing. He wasn't out of shape, he just didn't know how to camp. He carried a duffel bag in his right hand and a rolled-up sleeping bag under his arm. In his left hand, held very awkwardly, were his air rifle and a folding camp chair. His cheeks were red with effort under his thin black hair. His rapid breath came in puffs in the cold October air. He dropped the bag to the ground. With a grin and a flourish of his hand, he let the rifle fall so he could toss the chair in the air. He caught it and unfolded it on its way down. With a little bow of his head, he sat in the chair. "Couldn't camp closer to the road, could you? It's bad enough you talk us into coming out here to shoot each other. Do you have to add to my discomfort by making me hike until my nose runs?" He pulled a red bandana from his back pocket and blew his nose. Tom gave him a flat stare and stifled an urge to laugh. He could have sent a taxi to pick up Andy, and he still would have found something to grouse about. John dropped his pack without greeting Tom and crashed off into the darkness. They could hear him grunt and snap branches as he went. Andy and Tom exchanged a look. A few seconds later he stepped back into the glow of the fire carrying a log the size of a small tree stump and dropped it on the ground on its end. Then he brushed the top clean with the palm of his hand and wiped the back of his hand on his leg. His breath came in short gasps when he finally sat on the log. With a smile and a nod, he finally acknowledged Tom. Tom arched an eyebrow. "That looks heavy. Was there another one out there?" John thought for a second as he tried to catch his breath. "I think I saw one. Whoever owns this land must not have hauled out the whole tree after he cut it." "I'd ask you for one." Tom paused. "But you probably couldn't carry another one this soon after that one." John didn't dignify the taunt with an answer. He stalked back into the woods. Andy looked over the fire at Tom. "You been reading Tom Sawyer?" Tom tossed a fistful of sticks on the fire. "I'd feel guilty if I had a conscience. I only read it to see if he gets a shot at Becky." "Who's Becky?" "Obviously you haven't read the book." John crashed through the brush before Andy could reply. The chunk of wood in his arms was bigger than the first. He grunted under the weight of it, but his grin had "in your face" written all over it. It shook the ground when he dropped it at Tom's feet. "Don't try to trick me into getting another one. I only brought you that one because I'm a nice guy." "You're a very nice guy," Tom said as he got comfortable on the log. "How far away were you when you figured out I could have carried one all by myself?" 30 feet, John chuckled. Tom winked at Andy over the fire. "Not the fastest thinker in the world, is he?" "He's solar powered. It's dark out." They spent the rest of the evening talking over the fire. None of the three wanted to admit it, but they were afraid of what was going to happen after graduation. Tom wanted desperately to go to West Point and become a career Army officer. Andy was interested in law and politics. He didn't care where he went to college because he already had his eye on Detroit College of Law. John wanted to go into business, any business that would let him make a lot of money. The fire was a bed of coals when they decided to turn in. John dug a folding shovel from the bottom of his backpack and they put the fire out with dirt. Once it was out, they crawled in their tents. John and Andy shared Andy's. Tom had his own. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when something woke him. He lay on his back in the tent, eyes open, staring at nothing. He was a light sleeper, but rarely woke during the night unless something woke him. Something had changed. Didn't feel right. It was a little spooky. There weren't any animals to fear in the Michigan woods unless you were afraid of white-tailed deer. There were bears up north, but the only things to worry about in southwestern Michigan were raccoons in the garbage. He couldn't hear anything but normal sounds of the night. Then he heard a low rumble. It was more thrum than rumble, rhythmic but not mechanical. Staring up at the darkness, he tried to figure out what it was. A flash of light like lightning illuminated the tent. He flinched and waited for thunder. It didn't come. The ground pulsed and rumbled under his back. There was another flash of light, this time a brilliant red. Still no thunder. The ground shook again. Andy's voice floated from the other tent. "Tom, what are you up to out there?" He sounded like he wanted to laugh, even if he was the butt of a joke. "Nothing. I thought it was you guys." Another rumble broke the night. "Maybe you should check it out. Unless you're afraid." Tom smiled through his nervousness. "I see I'm not the only one who read Tom Sawyer." He waited for Andy to respond. All he heard was his friend's laughter and John's snores. "Is he still asleep?" "Snoring like an old man." Tom shook his head. "Give him a change of status, will you?" Andy was more than happy to comply. "You got it." He pulled his arm out of the sleeping bag, closed his hand in a fist, and slammed the side of it on John's sternum with a satisfying thud. "Wake up!" Tom heard a thunk and rush of expelled air. The string of curses following the thunk were proof that John was now awake. Another round of strange lightning and thrumming ground wiped the grin from his face and set his pulse racing. "Tom, get out of your tent and see what's going on," Andy shouted. "Why me?" John answered. "Because this was your idea, jackass." Good point. He hated it when they were right. He grabbed the flannel shirt he was using for a pillow and pulled it on. The ground thrummed again. And again. A triple flash of light illuminated the nylon. His eyes locked on his watch in the light. 3:17 a.m. He wasn't sure why it mattered what time it was, but knowing helped calm him a little. He unzipped the tent and stuck his head out. Wind shattered the silence, coming and going in a circular pattern. Leaves spun in eddies around him. He could hear them swish. He never felt wind do that. More flashes of light, this time greens and blues, brought his pulse up a few more notches. His mouth tingled as if he'd chewed aluminum foil. The last thing he wanted to do was admit he was afraid, but he was. The air felt strange when he crawled out, slow and sticky. Silver-white clouds surrounded the moon, casting it in films of pale gray darkness. The clouds moved swiftly in one direction, but the wind at ground level swirled around his ankles. He swallowed. Light flashed again from somewhere in the woods in front of him. He held his arm up to shade his eyes. Brilliant flashes of color blazed through the trees, making them look surreal and cartoonish. He cleared his throat and tried to sound nonchalant. "Come on out, guys. You really ought to see this." John's muffled voice came through the tent. "I'm not going out there with young Indiana Jones. You go out there." "All right, you big baby," Andy scoffed. The tent rustled as he yanked his shirt and jacket over his head. Tom looked at their tent and tried not to flinch when the ground thrummed under his feet. The tent changed colors with more blasts of light. He heard 2 quick zips when Andy opened the flap. His face flashed annoyance when he looked at Tom. His head and shoulders were out of the tent, hair sliding around his head in the wind. He rested on his knuckles and looked up. "If this is a joke, you went to too much trouble." "If this is how you look at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're going to die a lonely man," Tom laughed. Andy opened his mouth to say something, but it came out as a squawk. John's booted foot retreated back into the tent as Andy's face met the ground. Muttering under his breath, he scrambled to his feet, turned back to the tent, and shouted, "You better watch your back tomorrow. I've got 1,268 BBs with your name on 'em. Now who's the big baby?" John was still laughing when he stood next to Tom. The lights flashed through the trees. The wind, the strange circular wind, picked up speed. His laughter died in the air when he saw the trees. "We have to check this out," Tom said. "I think we'd be better off if we just go back to my house and spend the night." Andy tried to sound bored, but it didn't fool his friends. Tom shrugged. "Do what you want. I'm taking a look." He started walking toward the trees. John bumped Andy's shoulder. "Go ahead, genius. I'm right behind you." Andy looked at Tom's back, then at John, then in the direction of the car. He flinched when the wind brought a branch crashing down in the darkness nearby. He took 3 running steps in Tom's direction before he knew he made a decision. Andy frowned at their backs, then followed. "If there's an alien spaceship out there, I'm never going to forgive you guys." The woods were tangled with thorny plants, fallen branches, and a variety of large and small trees. Only Tom moved with confidence. He was 20 feet ahead of the other two. His small frame let him slip through gaps they didn't attempt. The multicolored lights flashed closer together as they climbed a slight grade. The wind was louder here, louder and faster, and Andy wished he could find something to laugh about, anything to lighten their mood. He knew his friends were as scared as he was, hoped they were anyway, but if Tom was, it didn't show. They came out of the trees and stopped at a ledge. The ground in front of them cut sharply downhill. They'd been there before and were expecting to look down a hill at 30 yards of level sandy ground, then a water-filled ditch, then a cinder-covered incline to railroad tracks. There was a mobile home park on the other side of the tracks. Before they were old enough to shoot each other with BBs, they used to spend their time putting coins on the tracks and trying to find them after the trains ran them over. They stopped doing that when they got tired of searching for coins they could never find. This time the atmosphere was different. They shielded their eyes against the flashes of color. The ground thrummed powerfully under their feet. John staggered back a step. Andy clutched his arm to keep from falling. Tom leaned forward with his legs spread against the wind, looking like a ski jumper preparing to land. "Are you sure you don't want to go back to my place?" Andy shouted over the wind. "I don't know what's happening on the planet Xenon, but I'm pretty sure I'd rather watch a porn movie in my basement. Wouldn't you guys?" They didn't answer. Halfway down they saw the source of the lights, a vertical hole surrounded by brilliant colors. The center was dark but not entirely black. A thick darkness swirled in varying shades of dark purple, midnight blue, obsidian black, and tendrils of silver. They could see the mobile home park through the hole. Walls of slashing light surrounded the cacophony of darkness. The ground throbbed in throbbing sync with swirling blue, magenta, and silver flashes of light surrounding the darkness. It made Andy want to puke. Tom turned and looked at them. The wind blew hard enough to rock him sideways, but he stood his ground. They couldn't see his face in the glare behind him, but his voice carried over the wind. "I'm going in." "I'm sorry," Andy shouted. "I don't think I heard you right." "Yeah, you did." He threw a look over his shoulder. "There's a hole big enough to drive a truck through. Don't you want to see what's on the other side?" "I'll tell you what's on the other side," John said. "A very steep, very hard hill." Tom looked at John, then turned his head, and Andy felt his eyes. "You were right, man. He is a big baby." Andy returned Tom's grin. He looked like he was about to plunge down the hill without another thought. Andy wasn't entirely opposed to the idea, but the hole didn't look like it was going away any time soon. "Hang on a second." Tom stopped as Andy looked wildly around, then saw a broken branch about 4 inches in diameter a few feet to his right. He ran to it. "Let's send this through first." Tom turned to John. "Grab that thing and throw it through the hole." "You forgot a word." Wind blew Tom's hair over his eyes. He shoved it away with a jerk of his hand. "What word?" "Oh, please?" "No, let's." Tom nodded. "Got it. Let's throw that thing through the hole." The ground thumped under their feet hard. Andy didn't like it. "Damn it, let's throw that thing through the hole now!" John went 10 feet down the hill and moved to the side. He had a hard time believing his eyes when he saw the hole was one-dimensional. Tom and Andy picked up the limb. "There's no other side to this thing." Tom knew that. He studied it in the few seconds before John and Andy caught up with him. Nothing around them was making the lights. There was no electricity out there, no cords, no lamps. They couldn't deny the existence of the thing in front of them. They couldn't explain it. It just was. He looked at Andy 3 feet behind him, holding the other end of the branch. "You ready?" Andy nodded. "On 3?" Andy nodded again. 1, 2, 3! They charged down the hill in leaping steps. When they got close to the hole, Tom pitched the limb ahead. Andy let go at almost the same time. The bark burned his hands as it slid under them, and a few branches scratched his face as he went by. He shoved. Both teens fell on their back on the hill to stop themselves from following the branch into the hole. They didn't hear it land on the other side, only a low rumble, and the ground shook. Andy closed his eyes, half expecting to see a blaze of white light through his eyelids. Tom stared at the swirling darkness. So much for the experiment. They didn't know anything now than they knew before. He looked at Andy and didn't shout, but they heard him say, "I'm going through." "The hell you are! You have no idea where that stick went." "I'll let you know." He leaped to his feet and charged down the slope to the black mouth of the hole. Without looking back, with no show of fear or thought of his own safety, Tom dove.